The morning sun illuminated the grandeur of the Smith mansion, where wealth and status were deeply ingrained in every corner. Rick Smith, the powerful heir to the family fortune, seemed to have it all. Yet, beneath his polished exterior, he was weighed down by family expectations and an impending marriage that felt more like a business contract. Just as he felt trapped by his luxurious life, the stress took a toll on him. Rick collapsed into a coma, leaving his family and fiancée, Adela, in turmoil. While Adela distanced herself, a dedicated nurse, Selena, watched over him, pouring her heart into his care. Unbeknownst to Rick, the real battle was not just for his life, but against sinister forces scheming to tear apart everything he had built. Will Rick wake up in time to reclaim his life, or has his fate already been sealed by those closest to him? If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Before we dive into this story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. A wealthy man lay still in a coma, his body lifeless as the days stretched into weeks. When he finally emerged from the darkness, blinking away the haze that clouded his senses, the first sight that met his eyes was not the familiar face of his family or friends, but the gentle presence of an immigrant woman by his bedside. Her soft touch and quiet demeanor contrasted sharply with the cold sterility of the hospital room, yet her compassion filled the air with warmth. Rick Smith had always been the man in control, the one people looked to for leadership and authority. But in that moment, he was nothing more than a vulnerable soul in need of care. The realization hit him harder than any blow. Outside the hospital walls, the majestic Smith mansion stood tall, its grand architecture a symbol of the family's immense wealth and status. Sunlight streamed through the vast windows, illuminating the marble floors, the intricately carved furniture, and the priceless works of art that adorned the rooms. Every inch of the estate radiated the power and prestige the Smith family had cultivated over generations. To the outside world, it was a fortress of success, but to those who lived inside, it was a gilded cage, where love was measured by achievements and worth was determined by the family's legacy. Rick Smith was the crown jewel of this empire. As the eldest son, his destiny had been sealed from the moment he took his first breath. He had been groomed to lead, to carry the weight of the family name with unwavering pride. Everything about him, his finely tailored suits, his perfectly groomed appearance, his commanding presence spoke of the refinement and expectations thrust upon him. But behind the polished exterior was a man struggling with the burden of his birthright. In his office, surrounded by financial reports and business contracts, Rick's eyes, once sharp and full of purpose, had grown dull, a reflection of the silent battle raging inside him. His heart was heavy with the weight of decisions that seemed less like choices and more like obligations. As he sat at his desk, poring over the latest figures, Rick's mind wandered to the looming event that consumed his thoughts: the upcoming marriage to Adela Gomez. Adela was the perfect match by every measure of status and propriety. She was stunning, poised, and hailed from a family nearly as prestigious as his own. On paper, their union was a masterstroke, a merging of two powerful families that would only elevate their standing in the elite circles they inhabited. But in Rick's heart, something was amiss. As the days ticked down to the wedding, he found himself engulfed in an ever-growing sense of dread. Marriage was supposed to be a celebration of love, a joyful union between two souls, but for Rick, it felt like another transaction, another deal to secure the Smith family's legacy. The closer he got to the wedding, the more distant he felt from the life he was about to enter. It wasn't Adela herself who caused his turmoil. She was, by all accounts, everything a man in his position could desire. Yet, every thought of her filled him with a profound sense of emptiness. There was no spark, no connection that made him believe in the lifelong commitment he was about to make. Instead, it felt like a carefully orchestrated play, one where he was the lead actor, but the script had been written long before he even understood the role. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 1 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Despite the storm brewing in his heart, Rick had always been a man who did what was expected of him. From an early age, he had been taught to suppress his feelings, to never let personal desires interfere with his duties. Love, happiness, fulfillment, these were luxuries, secondary to the mission of upholding the family name. And so, as he wrestled with his doubts, Rick buried them deep. He would marry Adela, not because he wanted to, but because it was what was required of him. His life had never been about personal fulfillment. It was about maintaining the empire built by his ancestors. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the heavy office door creaking open. Without looking up, Rick already knew who it was. His mother, Victoria Smith, entered the room with the regal authority that had always defined her. Victoria was not just the matriarch of the family, she was its backbone. A woman whose iron will had kept the Smith legacy intact through decades of change and challenges. She had raised her sons with a singular focus: to protect and expand the family's influence, no matter the personal cost. Victoria stood tall, her gaze as sharp as ever, surveying her eldest son, as if assessing his readiness for the task ahead. She had always been able to read Rick, even when he tried to hide his feelings. But in her world, emotions were a weakness, and she had no patience for them. To her, Rick's fatigue and his inner conflict were inconsequential. What mattered was that the Smith name remained untarnished and that their legacy continued to grow. "Rick," she said, her voice as commanding as ever, "have you reviewed the details of the wedding reception? We cannot afford any mistakes. This wedding is far too important for our family." Her words were delivered with the precision of a general issuing orders before a battle. To Victoria, the wedding was not just a union of two people. It was a strategic move, a power play that would secure their position at the top of society. The pressure was suffocating, but Rick knew better than to show it. He had learned long ago that in his mother's eyes, there was no room for weakness. "Yes, Mother," Rick replied, his voice steady, though lacking any real enthusiasm. "Adela and the planners are handling everything. There's nothing to worry about." Victoria's gaze lingered on him, searching for any sign of hesitation. She noticed the weariness in her son's eyes, the slight sag of his shoulders, but chose not to address it. In her mind, there was no place for personal struggles. The Smith family had always thrived on strength, and she expected nothing less from her children. "Good," she said curtly. "Remember, Rick, this wedding is not just about you. It's about our family, our legacy. Everything we've worked for depends on this." Her words, heavy with expectation, wrapped around Rick like chains, tightening with every syllable. He nodded, understanding all too well what was at stake, yet feeling a deep sorrow that he couldn't fully express. This was his life, one of duty, of sacrifice, of always putting the family first. But as he sat there, staring at the papers in front of him, Rick couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing himself in the process. "I know, Mother," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do what's necessary." And so, Rick remained trapped in the gilded cage of his family's legacy, a man torn between duty and desire, between the life he was expected to lead and the one he secretly longed for. The wedding would come, and the family name would be preserved, but at what cost? The answer, Rick feared, was more than he was willing to give. Satisfied with Rick's response, Victoria gave his shoulder a brief, almost mechanical pat before leaving the office, her heels clicking on the polished floor as she exited. The heavy door closed with a soft thud, leaving Rick in the silence of his office, alone with the weight of his unspoken thoughts. As soon as his mother was gone, Rick let out a long, weary sigh, feeling the invisible chains of expectation tighten around him. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to summon the strength that seemed to be slipping through his fingers. But instead of finding solace, he was met with a strange, creeping fatigue. It was more than just exhaustion from work or the relentless demands of his responsibilities. It was something deeper, something that had been festering in the quiet corners of his soul for years, and now it was finally beginning to make itself known. Just then, the sharp ring of the phone shattered the silence, pulling Rick abruptly from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was Adela. Her name flashed in a soft glow, but to Rick, it felt more like a warning than a comfort. He picked up, and her voice, sweet but meticulously calculated, filled his ear. She reminded him of the dinner they were due to have that evening with her parents. The Gomez's, a social obligation Rick had known was coming but now felt like an insurmountable burden. "Of course, Adela. I'll be there," Rick replied, his voice carefully controlled, trying to inject some enthusiasm he didn't feel. As the call ended, he set the phone down and stared at it, the pressure in his chest intensifying with every passing second. A question, one he had long pushed to the back of his mind, began to echo with increasing urgency. Is this really what I want for my life? It lingered like an unwelcome guest, a reminder of the growing discontent he could no longer suppress. The wedding, the responsibilities, the expectations, all of it felt suffocating. And with his health beginning to falter, the question became even more insistent, a drumbeat he couldn't ignore. Pushing himself up from the chair, Rick moved to the large window overlooking the mansion's immaculate gardens. The lush greenery stretched as far as the eye could see, each hedge and flower perfectly maintained, a living symbol of the wealth and power that had defined his family's existence. But as Rick stood there, gazing out at the vast estate, he felt an unsettling sense of detachment. It was as if the world he had once cherished had somehow become foreign to him, a beautiful but empty landscape that no longer held any meaning. Nightfall soon came, and Rick found himself standing at the entrance of an opulent restaurant, its interior glowing with the soft flicker of candlelight. The establishment was renowned for its exclusivity, a place where the elite dined in whispered tones, cloaked in designer suits and gowns that screamed of wealth. The tables were adorned with delicate centerpieces, and the waitstaff moved with quiet efficiency, ensuring that everything was nothing short of perfect. This was the world Rick had always known, a world of luxury and privilege, but tonight, it felt more like a gilded prison than ever before. Rick and Adela arrived arm in arm, the very picture of a powerful couple. They looked every bit the part, flawless and admired by all who saw them. But as they walked toward their reserved table, Rick couldn't shake the growing unease in his chest. His arm rested around Adela's waist, but even the physical contact felt distant, like a rehearsed performance rather than an expression of genuine affection. Adela smiled, that practiced, perfect smile she had mastered long ago, aware that all eyes were on them. But to Rick, her beauty, once mesmerizing, now felt like another layer of the facade he was trapped in. As they took their seats at the elegantly laid table, Adela leaned in close, her voice soft but deliberate. "Remember to mention the collaboration with my family's foundation during dinner, darling," she whispered, her words like a well-timed reminder of the roles they were both expected to play. Rick nodded, though his mind was far from the conversation. The foundation, the alliances, the social games, it all felt like part of a charade he no longer wanted to be a part of. Still, he sat there, playing his role, while inside, the distance between him and the life he was living grew wider with each passing moment. The dinner unfolded as expected, with polite conversation, compliments exchanged between families, and endless discussions about the wedding. Adela's parents, seated beside Victoria and Rick's younger brother, Andre, were all too pleased with the union, speaking in glowing terms about the future it would secure. For them, this marriage was not just a celebration of love, it was a strategic alliance, a merger of two dynasties. As the others spoke with excitement about the upcoming nuptials, Rick found himself retreating further into his thoughts, watching from the outside as his life unfolded before him like a scripted play. Across the table, Adela sparkled under the attention, her laughter light and effortless, her every move designed to impress. Her flawless skin, her sparkling eyes, her graceful presence, it was easy to see why she was the envy of many. But Rick, who had once been captivated by her beauty, now saw something else. Behind the charm, behind the poised exterior, was a relentless ambition, a hunger for status and recognition that seemed to consume her. As he watched her laugh and converse, the realization hit him with a force that left him breathless. He didn't know this woman, not truly. She was a stranger, an image he had admired but never fully understood. For so long, Rick had convinced himself that their relationship made sense, that it was the natural progression of his life. But now, on the eve of their wedding, the doubts he had buried deep within him were rising to the surface with a fury he couldn't ignore. Everything about this evening, this dinner, this engagement, this life felt wrong, as if he were living someone else's dream. In a desperate attempt to escape his spiraling thoughts, Rick took a long sip of wine, feeling its warmth spread through him. He leaned forward, joining the conversation, his voice measured and deliberate. "The collaboration with the Gomez Foundation is a perfect opportunity for both our families to work together on something meaningful," he said, forcing a smile as he delivered the rehearsed line. Adela's parents beamed with approval, their faces glowing with satisfaction. Adela turned to him with a smile, but this time Rick saw through it. Something was calculating in her gaze, something that made his stomach turn. The woman who sat beside him, the woman he was about to marry, was not the partner he had imagined. She was part of the machine he had been born into, a cog in the relentless pursuit of power and status. As the evening wore on, Rick couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at a crossroads, one where every step forward felt like a step further away from himself. The wedding was only days away, the path laid out before him. But as he looked around at the people who had shaped his life, he couldn't help but wonder, was it too late to turn back? Or had he already given too much of himself to the world he was born into? The answers lingered, heavy and unresolved, as the night continued and the weight of expectation threatened to suffocate him entirely. As the dinner wore on, Rick's chest began to tighten, a sensation far beyond the usual stress that accompanied these gatherings. It was an unshakable pressure, almost as if his body was crying out in protest, reflecting what his mind had been trying to tell him for months. but that he had stubbornly ignored. He stared into his wine glass, the reflection of his strained face staring back at him, distorted by the crystal, a metaphor for the life he was leading. The perfect image, the flawless facade he had so meticulously maintained, was slowly unraveling before his eyes, and the terrifying part was that he didn't know how to stop it. The dinner finally ended, and the obligatory smiles, handshakes, and pleasantries were exchanged, wrapping up the evening with the same superficial niceties that masked the undercurrent of pressure they all felt. Rick walked out of the restaurant with Adela by his side, their hands intertwined for the benefit of onlookers, yet the silence between them felt more profound than ever. It was the kind of silence that filled the space between people who were physically close but emotionally worlds apart. As they walked to the car, Adela, sensing something off, gently tugged his hand. "Rick, is everything all right?" she asked, her tone laced with a mixture of concern and impatience. Rick nodded, unable to find the words to articulate the growing storm inside him. His thoughts were consumed by the tightness in his chest, the disconnect between the life he was living and the man he truly was, or the man he had hoped to be. He couldn't hold it in any longer. The words came out, hesitant at first, almost a whisper as if he was testing them. "Adela," he began, "have you ever wondered if this is what we want?" If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 2 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. The question hung in the air like an accusation. Adela stopped in her tracks, visibly taken aback. She turned to face him, confusion clouding her features, quickly followed by something sharper, disdain, maybe, or irritation. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice measured, but there was a tremor of nervousness beneath it. She was not used to Rick questioning anything, least of all the life they were about to seal with the wedding. "This life," Rick continued, gesturing vaguely as if trying to encompass the enormity of what he felt. "The wedding. Everything. It's like we're following a script written by our families, by society, by expectations, not by us. Is this really what we want, or are we just doing what's expected of us?" Adela's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, her eyes narrowing. "Rick, you know our lives have always been destined for this. It's not about what we want, it's about who we are. We've worked too hard to walk away from everything we've built." There was a steely conviction in her voice, the same conviction Rick had once found comforting, but now it sounded hollow to him. The words hit Rick like a slap, driving home the chasm that had grown between them. The more Adela spoke, the more he realized she couldn't understand him. And at that moment he saw with painful clarity that she never truly had. "Maybe you're right," Rick said softly, his voice tinged with resignation that cut deeper than any argument could. The weight of those words settled on him like a stone. He had hoped, deep down, that she might feel the same disillusionment he did, but instead, her words confirmed what he had feared. They were on 2 entirely different paths. Adela, relieved that the conversation hadn't escalated into something more serious, leaned in and kissed him on the cheek. "Trust me, Rick, everything will be fine," she said, her tone meant to be reassuring. But all Rick felt was the chill of a false comfort that only highlighted the coldness between them. She gave him a smile, one of those perfectly crafted smiles that she had perfected for public appearances, and they continued to walk in silence. Back at the mansion, Rick retreated to his bedroom, feeling an emptiness so profound it seemed to echo in the hollow corridors of his heart. He undressed slowly, each movement heavy with the weight of thoughts that wouldn't stop circling his mind. He felt trapped, not just in his life but in his very skin, bound by expectations so ingrained in him that they felt like shackles. As he pulled back the luxurious duvet and lay down, he stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying the conversation over and over. "Is this the life I want?" The walls seemed to close in on him, the mansion that had always been a symbol of his success now feeling more like a gilded cage. Rick knew he needed to talk to someone, to share the burden of the doubts that were slowly consuming him. But every time he tried, he was met with the same response, the same wall of expectations, responsibilities, and unspoken rules that defined his existence. He was alone in a life that was supposed to be full of everything anyone could ever want. The hours dragged on, and despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded him. His mind was a battlefield, every thought another reminder of the life he was trapped in, a life that no longer felt like his own. Eventually, his body gave in to the weight of his emotions, and Rick drifted into a restless, dreamless sleep. When he awoke, the faint light of dawn was just beginning to break through the heavy curtains. But the new day brought no relief. His body ached, not just from the sleepless night, but from something deeper, a fatigue that had settled into his bones, as if the very act of living this life was slowly draining the life out of him. He glanced at the clock, 6:00 a.m. A long day of meetings, responsibilities, and appearances stretched ahead of him. But all he could focus on was the relentless pressure in his chest, the tightness that refused to ease. Dragging himself out of bed, Rick forced himself through the motions. He dressed in one of his custom-tailored suits, perfectly pressed and ready for another day in the world that demanded perfection from him. But as he looked at himself in the mirror, adjusting his tie, he barely recognized the man staring back at him. The suit, the polished shoes, the neatly combed hair, it all felt like a costume he was forced to wear, while the real Rick, the one hidden beneath layers of duty and expectation, was screaming to be heard. But he couldn't scream. He couldn't break. Being a Smith meant never showing weakness, no matter how suffocating the weight became. And so, with the pressure in his chest building, Rick steeled himself for another day, knowing that despite everything, he had no choice but to keep going. The bathroom mirror revealed a haunting reflection. Rick's once vibrant face now appeared ghostly pale, shadowed by deep, dark circles, his eyes hollow and devoid of life. Desperately, he splashed cold water on his face, hoping to snap out of the exhaustion that clung to him. But the fatigue had dug its claws deep into his soul, suffocating both body and mind. Downstairs, Victoria, his mother, sat in the dining room as always, her presence an unshakable pillar of authority. Mrs. Smith, impeccably dressed in her signature silk, radiated an air of control as she sipped her coffee, her sharp eyes immediately locking onto Rick as he entered. "Rick, you look dreadful." "Didn't sleep again." Victoria's tone, cold and dismissive, lacked any hint of genuine concern. "Just tired, mother." "I'm fine," Rick muttered, attempting to brush off the growing weight on his shoulders. Victoria scrutinized him, her eyes piercing as if assessing whether her son could withstand the storm brewing within him. She knew the crushing demands he faced, yet chose silence. In her world, weakness had no place. "You cannot afford to be weak today, Rick. The meeting with the Japanese investors is critical. If you don't secure that deal, the company's future is at risk." Her voice was sharp, laced with pressure, as if the entire world depended on his success. Rick nodded, but the thought of enduring another meeting felt unbearable. Every step and every decision seemed like a mountain to climb, and he was drowning under the weight of expectation. He ate in silence, each bite reminding him that his life had become a series of ticking clocks, every second scrutinized under his mother's ever-watchful gaze. As the hours crept by, Rick found himself moving through the motions, taking calls, reviewing reports, preparing for the meeting, his body functioning like a machine, but his mind frayed, teetering on the edge of collapse. The relentless pressure consumed him, gnawing at his spirit, and leaving him feeling more like a prisoner than a man in control. The time for the meeting arrived, and Rick entered the boardroom with a forced confidence, greeting the investors. Sitting at the head of the table, the place that had always given him a false sense of power, he now felt utterly powerless, the reins of control slipping from his grasp. As the meeting progressed, Rick fought to stay present. His voice, though steady, lacked the fire it once had. The investors listened, intrigued, but Rick's heart pounded violently in his chest, a silent scream begging for release. Cold sweat drenched his brow, and his vision began to spin. Mid-sentence, the room started to blur, and an overwhelming dizziness consumed him. Gripping the table for support, Rick felt the crushing weight of his body betray him. The investors stared, their confusion turning to shock as Rick's words faltered. "Excuse me," he whispered, but his body no longer obeyed. Pain shot through his chest, sharp and relentless, like an iron fist squeezing his heart. The room twisted, voices fading, and Rick tumbled into a darkness that swallowed him whole. He collapsed, his body hitting the floor with a sickening thud as gasps of horror filled the air. Chaos erupted. Emergency services were called, but the damage had been done. Rick lay motionless, trapped between life and death. The news of Rick's collapse swept through the building like wildfire, reaching Victoria's ears within moments. A pang of terror pierced her, but years of mastering her emotions forced a panic deep inside. She couldn't afford to show fear, not now, not ever. As she made her way to the boardroom, her mind raced not with thoughts of her son's well-being, but with the consequences of this tragedy on the family name and company. Adela, Rick's fiancée, was consumed by her selfish dread. Though their relationship had been strained, she never imagined it would come to this. The thought of losing the future she had meticulously planned, the luxury, The power filled her with a cold, gut-wrenching fear. The man who was supposed to secure her dream life was now fighting for his own. At the hospital, doctors worked frantically to save Rick, but the diagnosis was bleak. Years of neglect and stress had worn his body down, and now he was slipping away, trapped in a coma. The days that followed were a hellish blur, filled with agonizing waiting, as doctors solemnly informed the family there was no guarantee he would ever wake up. As Rick lay in a deep, unresponsive state, the whispers began. The powerful Smith family, once untouchable, now found themselves vulnerable, their every move scrutinized by the public eye. The press fed on the drama, and rumors about Rick's condition and the future of the empire spread like wildfire. Victoria, cold and calculating, masked her devastation with a facade of strength. But deep down, guilt gnawed at her insides. Had she driven her son to this breaking point? Had her relentless pursuit of perfection destroyed the one person she was meant to protect? Meanwhile, Adela's visits became increasingly rare. The weight of staying beside a man who might never wake up was unbearable. Fear of losing the life she craved overtook any sense of loyalty or love. She began to drift away, distancing herself emotionally and physically, consumed by thoughts of what her future would hold without Rick. And as Rick lay in the hospital bed, his once mighty family crumbled around him. The facade they had built of success, power, and control was disintegrating, revealing the fragile, hollow core that had been hiding beneath all along. The hospital had transformed into a somber fortress, silently standing watch over Rick Smith's life. In the hushed stillness of the intensive care unit, his body lay motionless, encased in the sterile grip of machines, tubes, and flickering monitors. They hummed softly, keeping track of his fragile pulse, every beep reminding the world that Rick was clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. His room was a sanctuary of silence, disrupted only by the rhythmic rise and fall of the machines, vigilant and unfeeling. Visits were rare, meticulously timed, and filled with unbearable tension allowed only for his closest family members and his fiancée, Adela. Even these brief encounters felt more like duty than genuine care. Yet within this sterile space, there was one presence that went beyond mere obligation, someone whose care for Rick ran much deeper than the professional duties she was assigned. Selena, a young immigrant nurse with gentle hands and a heart full of empathy, had been taking care of Rick since the very day he was admitted. To her, nursing was more than a job, it was an act of salvation, a means to find healing for the wounds life had dealt her. Having escaped a homeland ravaged by war and loss, Selena had poured her soul into her work. Her days were long, filled with the suffering and recovery of others, but something about Rick's vulnerable state stirred something even deeper in her spirit. His unconscious form, lifeless yet still fighting, seemed to reflect the same struggle that she had once known, a battle between despair and survival. Though Rick was unaware, Selena felt an unspoken connection to him, a bond born from the shared human experience of pain. Every day, Selena tended to Rick with unwavering dedication. Her care was meticulous, checking his vitals, adjusting his medication, and making sure that no detail was overlooked. Yet it was the time she spent beyond her duties that revealed the depth of her devotion. In the quiet moments when no one else was there, Selena would sit by his bedside and talk to him as if he were awake. She shared stories of her childhood, of the home she had left behind, the dreams she still harbored in her heart. Some days she would simply talk about the mundane events of the hospital, the small moments that filled her days. In those moments, it was as if she believed her words could somehow reach across the divide between life and death, pulling Rick back from the abyss that had claimed him. The other nurses began to notice Selena's unwavering attention. There was something in the way she cared for Rick that went beyond the call of duty. Her eyes would linger on him just a little longer, her hands would adjust his sheets with an almost maternal tenderness. Though their relationship was strictly professional, there was an undeniable bond between them, an unspoken connection that surpassed the sterile boundaries of patient and caregiver. Meanwhile, Adela, the woman who was supposed to be Rick's greatest source of support, began to drift further away. What had once been concern had transformed into apathy. Her visits to the hospital became increasingly rare, and when she did come, it was clear her mind was elsewhere. The woman who once stood by Rick's side with conviction now seemed disconnected, her presence reduced to a hollow obligation. The shadow of Lucas, with his manipulative words and subtle suggestions, had begun to pull her further and further from the man she was meant to care for. While Selena remained blissfully unaware of the chaos brewing outside the hospital room, her daily devotion to Rick never wavered. Each morning she would check his vitals with precision, but it was the small things that revealed her true dedication, the way she would gently adjust his pillow, or how her fingers would linger for just a moment on his hand as if hoping he might feel her warmth and respond. On certain days, she noticed subtle changes, barely perceptible, perhaps a slight movement in his fingers, a faint twitch in his eyelids, as if his body was trying, even in its weakened state, to reach out to the world around him. While Selena quietly carried out her vigil in the hospital, a much darker battle was unfolding outside. Thomas, Rick's closest confidant and trusted lawyer, had grown suspicious. He refused to believe that Rick's collapse was merely the result of overwork and stress. It gnawed at him, the feeling that something far more insidious had caused his friend's fall from power. Determined to uncover the truth, Thomas began a personal investigation, retracing Rick's last few months, digging into the labyrinth of business dealings, financial transactions, and personal relationships that surrounded him. What Thomas found was deeply unsettling. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but the deeper he dug, the more he uncovered troubling signs. There were deals Rick had entered into that didn't align with his usual cautious nature, high-risk investments that were reckless and uncharacteristic. Financial pressures had been mounting in the weeks before his collapse, and certain transactions simply didn't add up. Something or someone had been manipulating Rick's world from the shadows. As Thomas connected the dots, his suspicions quickly turned toward Lucas, the cunning businessman who had been inching closer to Adela in the months leading up to Rick's collapse. Lucas had a reputation for being ruthless and opportunist, who knew how to manipulate people and situations to his advantage. Thomas had heard whispers about Lucas before, rumors of shady deals and backhanded tactics. But what disturbed him most was how quickly Lucas had inserted himself into Rick's life through Adela. Lucas had seen Rick as an obstacle, a hurdle to be removed, and Adela was his way in. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 3 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. As Thomas gathered more evidence, a dark, twisted picture began to emerge. Lucas had carefully orchestrated a plan to bring Rick down, using Adela as an unwitting pawn in his game of power and wealth. He had taken advantage of her emotional vulnerability, subtly encouraging her doubts and fears about her future with Rick. And now, with Rick incapacitated, Lucas was poised to swoop in and take control not just of Adela, but of the entire Smith fortune. Time was running out. Thomas knew that every day Rick remained in a coma, Lucas's grip tightened, and Adela drifted further into his web. The stakes were more than just financial. This was a battle for Rick's very life, his legacy, and everything he had built. Thomas needed to act quickly to expose Lucas's plot before it was too late. Inside the hospital, however, Adela's visits were becoming a mere formality. Her time by Rick's bedside was filled with silence, her thoughts elsewhere. She would sit, barely glancing at the man who had once been the center of her world, now reduced to a shell of his former self. The sight of Rick lying there, so vulnerable, so powerless, made her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't articulate. She wanted to run, to escape the suffocating reality of what her life had become. And Lucas, charming, persuasive, and ever-present, was offering her a way out. Lucas knew exactly when to strike. He had been patient, slowly working his way into Adela's life, planting seeds of doubt, offering solutions that seemed all too convenient. One afternoon, as Adela left the hospital, tired and emotionally drained, Lucas was waiting for her. Leaning casually against his sleek luxury car, he offered her a sympathetic smile. His timing was perfect. Adela, desperate for an escape from the oppressive hospital environment, didn't think twice when he suggested they grab coffee together. Over coffee, Lucas turned up the charm, weaving a narrative that offered Adela the very thing she craved, an escape from her crumbling life. He sympathized with her plight, praised her strength, and subtly planted the idea that maybe it was time for her to start thinking about her future. He never outright said she should abandon Rick, but his words were laced with temptation. "Adela, you're too strong to let this situation trap you," Lucas said softly, his gaze holding hers. "You need to think about what's best for you. Rick may not wake up, and you have a future to consider." Adela's heart raced as she listened. The weight of Lucas's words began to sink in, tempting her with a vision of freedom, of power, of a life that wasn't weighed down by uncertainty. She knew it wasn't right morally, ethically. It felt wrong. But the fear of losing everything she had built, the terror of facing a future tied to a man who may never wake up, clouded her judgment. Lucas was offering her the chance to secure her future, and the temptation was becoming harder to resist. Lucas's words echoed in her mind long after they parted ways, his promises a seductive whisper that refused to leave her alone. He had painted a future where she could remain in control, where she wouldn't have to depend on anyone, least of all Rick. It was a selfish choice, but it was also a lifeline, a way out of the suffocating uncertainty that had become her life. And as Adela drove away from the hospital that afternoon, her thoughts were no longer with Rick. They were with Lucas and the dark, tempting future he had promised her. As the hours blurred into days and the days melted into weeks, Selena remained a steadfast figure in Rick Smith's life, her presence an unwavering beacon of care and quiet determination. Every morning as her shift began, she would enter Rick's room with the same serene grace, the air thick with the steady hum of machines that monitored his every breath and heartbeat. But Selena's approach to Rick went beyond the clinical routines of caregiving. For her, this was not just a job, it was a mission, a deeply personal calling. Each day began with ritualistic precision. Selena would adjust the beeping machines, ensuring they captured every nuance of his vital signs. She carefully checked his medications, all while maintaining an aura of calm, as though her presence alone could offer comfort to the man lying still in the bed. But it was the moments she spent holding his hand, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke to him, that revealed the depth of her devotion. She talked to Rick not as a comatose patient, but as if he were sitting across from her, fully aware of everything she said. Selena poured out her heart in these moments. She told him about her day, the small details that made up life in the hospital, and sometimes even her own past, her memories of the war-torn country she had fled, the hopes she held for her new life. And though the doctors assured her that Rick couldn't hear her, she refused to believe it. She had learned to read the subtleties in his body, slight changes in muscle tension, a shift in his breathing, and while others dismissed them as involuntary reflexes, Selena held on to the idea that they were signs that somewhere deep within Rick was present, locked in a battle to return. The other nurses saw the quiet care that Selena gave to Rick, and though they didn't fully understand the bond she had formed with him, they respected her deeply. They knew she went far beyond what was required, that her care for Rick was something extraordinary, fueled by a deep sense of empathy and hope. While Selena's world revolved around the silent vigil she kept over Rick, the Smith family was unraveling. Victoria Smith, Rick's mother, clung desperately to her facade of strength, refusing to show any sign of weakness as the days passed with no improvement in her son's condition. But behind closed doors, the strain was becoming unbearable. She had always been the commanding matriarch, the woman who could control any situation. Yet now she was powerless, forced to watch helplessly as her son's life hung in the balance. Andres, Rick's younger brother, was also spiraling, trapped in the shadow of his brother even in his absence. He had always lived in Rick's towering shadow, and now, with Rick incapacitated, he felt a gnawing sense of guilt, as though even his brother's illness somehow kept him from stepping into the light. The weight of expectation was crushing, and without Rick to guide the family, Andres felt increasingly lost. Adela, Rick's fiancée, had distanced herself almost entirely. What had begun as anxious concern had quickly turned into avoidance. Each time she visited Rick, guilt gnawed at her insides, a creeping sense of shame over the choices she had been making. Lucas, with his promises of security and power, had lured her into a moral quagmire, and though she knew it was wrong, the temptation was hard to resist. Each visit to Rick's bedside only served as a reminder of the life she had been planning to leave behind. But there was still a shadow of doubt, a whisper of guilt that reminded her of the man she once loved. Selena, blissfully unaware of the drama playing out in the Smith family, remained focused on her work. She knew her primary responsibility was to keep Rick stable, but in her heart, she also believed that her presence, her care, could somehow help bring him back. There were moments when, as she spoke to him or read aloud, she would see the tiniest flickers of movement, maybe a twitch of his hand, the faintest flutter of his eyelids, and though the medical staff insisted these were nothing more than reflexes, Selena clung to them. To her, they were proof that Rick was fighting, trying to break free from the prison of his coma. As the chapter of this long vigil closed, the hospital room grew quiet, the dim evening light casting long shadows across the room. Selena, preparing Rick's room for the night, moved with practiced care. The lights were lowered, the machines beeped softly, and a calmness settled over the space. She adjusted his sheets, made sure his pillow was just right, and then, as she had done countless times before, she sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. Her voice, low and full of conviction, broke the stillness. "I know you can hear me, Rick," she whispered. "You're not alone. I'm here with you." And then it happened, a moment so brief, so subtle, it could have easily gone unnoticed. Rick's hand, still and lifeless for so long, gave the slightest, almost imperceptible squeeze. It was a tiny movement, one that could have been written off as nothing, but for Selena it was everything. Her heart leapt, a surge of hope washing over her. In that small gesture, she found all the validation she needed. Rick was still there, deep down, fighting to return. As dawn approached, a heavy tension lingered over the hospital, a sense that something was about to shift. Outside Rick's room, Thomas, Rick's best friend and lawyer, had been tirelessly investigating the events leading up to Rick's collapse. He had spent weeks combing through business records, financial transactions, and personal relationships, and what he found confirmed his worst suspicions. Lucas was at the center of it all. The manipulations, the financial irregularities, and Adela's increasingly erratic behavior, it all pointed to Lucas, the cunning businessman who had wormed his way into Rick's life through Adela. Thomas had uncovered enough to know that Lucas wasn't just a passive player. He had been actively working to undermine Rick, both personally and professionally. The financial pressures Rick had been under, the risky deals he had taken on, none of it made sense until Thomas realized that Lucas had been orchestrating it all, pushing Rick to the brink while simultaneously pulling Adela into his web. And now, with Rick incapacitated, Lucas was poised to seize control of everything. Thomas knew time was running out. He needed to act quickly to protect Rick and his legacy. That morning, with his evidence in hand, Thomas headed to the hospital, determined to confront Adela and pull her away from Lucas's influence. When he found her, sitting alone in the hospital cafeteria, her face etched with worry, he knew it was time. "Adela, we need to talk," he said, his voice heavy with urgency. Adela looked up, startled by the intensity in his voice, but she nodded. Together, they moved to a private room where they could speak without being overheard. Thomas wasted no time. "I've been looking into what happened before Rick's collapse, and all the signs point to Lucas. He's been manipulating the company, diverting funds, and using your relationship to push Rick over the edge. Adela, he's using you." Adela felt the world tilt beneath her. She had known, deep down, that Lucas was dangerous, but she had been too afraid to admit it. Hearing Thomas's words brought a crashing wave of realization, a sickening confirmation of everything she had been trying to ignore. "Do you have proof?" she asked, her voice trembling. Thomas handed her an envelope filled with documents, evidence of Lucas's betrayal. "These are the transactions, the contracts, everything you need to see. Lucas has been playing a long game, and if we don't stop him now, he's going to destroy everything Rick has built." Adela's hands shook as she read through the papers. Every word, every figure seemed to confirm the truth she had been denying. Lucas had used her, played on her insecurities and fears to get what he wanted. "I can't believe I let it go this far," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Thomas leaned forward, his tone urgent. "There's still time to stop this, but we need to act now. You have to distance yourself from Lucas, and together we can expose him." Adela looked up at Thomas, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and resolve. She had made a terrible mistake, but there was still a chance to make things right. "You're right," she said, her voice stronger now. "I won't let Lucas ruin everything. I'll do whatever it takes to protect Rick and the family." The hospital, usually enveloped in its serene morning routine, was suddenly abuzz with a quiet tension as something extraordinary happened in Rick Smith's room. After what felt like an eternity of waiting, weeks spent in the cold grip of a coma, Rick's body began to stir. His eyelids, heavy with the weight of weeks spent in darkness, fluttered ever so slightly. Selena, who had been diligently checking the monitors as she did every morning, noticed the subtle movement immediately. Her heart skipped a beat, and she moved closer to his side, hope swelling in her chest. "Rick," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Her eyes locked onto his face as she waited for a sign, any sign, that he might be waking. The monitors began to show small but significant changes. His heart rate evened out, his breathing grew more rhythmic, and a faint but steady pulse of life returned to his once still form. Without breaking her gaze, Selena pressed the emergency button, summoning the doctors. In what felt like mere moments, the medical team rushed into the room, their faces alight with a mixture of shock and anticipation. They moved with professional urgency, checking his vitals, running tests while Rick's hand twitched as if trying to grasp onto something, as though reaching for life itself. The lead doctor exchanged a meaningful look with Selena, his voice barely able to contain the relief. "It seems like he's coming back," he said, a smile of cautious hope pulling at his lips. Selena stayed rooted to her spot beside Rick's bed, her hand resting gently on his, her pulse racing with nervous excitement. Slowly, almost painfully, Rick's eyes began to crack open, blinking against the harsh fluorescent light. His vision was blurry, his mind a swirling fog of confusion. But when his gaze finally settled on Selena, there was a moment of connection that seemed to transcend everything else in the room. Where am I?" Rick croaked, his voice raw and weak from disuse, the simple act of speaking a monumental effort. Selena's smile, full of relief and tenderness, broke through the tension in the room. "You're in the hospital, Rick," she said softly, her voice soothing. "You've been in a coma, but now you're waking up. Everything's going to be okay. We're here for you." She held his hand tighter, as if her strength alone could pull him fully back into the world. Rick's eyes darted around the room, struggling to piece together fragments of memory and reality. He looked at Selena again, his brow furrowed in confusion, trying to make sense of the warmth and care he felt emanating from this stranger. Who are you?" he asked, his voice still shaky. "I'm Selena," she replied, her voice gentle but steady. "I've been your nurse, taking care of you since you were brought here." Rick stared at her, his mind clouded by a haze of memories that refused to come into focus. He knew her face, but everything felt distant, as if he were trying to recall a dream. Despite the confusion, there was something comforting about her presence, something that eased the fear that had begun to settle in his chest. While the doctors continued their tests, ensuring Rick was stable and assessing the extent of his recovery, the news of his awakening began to spread like wildfire throughout the hospital. The whispers moved from room to room, from one staff member to the next, until they reached the ears of his family. Victoria, his ever-stoic mother, and Adela, his fiancée, were informed immediately. For Adela, the news brought an unsettling mix of relief and dread. The knowledge that Rick had awakened meant facing the consequences of her recent choices that had driven her further from him, into the arms of Lucas and his hollow promises. Guilt gnawed at her, but fear of what would come next nearly paralyzed her. Victoria, though relieved, was also walking a tightrope of emotions. She had always prided herself on her strength, on being the one who could hold the family together in even the most difficult of times. But the weight of Rick's awakening brought with it complications she had been avoiding. For years, she had kept secrets, things that, if revealed, could shatter the careful image of control and power she had cultivated. As she made her way to the hospital, the relief of seeing her son awake was tinged with an undercurrent of fear. What would Rick remember? What would he discover about the empire she had helped build? If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 4 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Back in Rick's room, Selena remained close, helping him take small sips of water, her voice a steady stream of reassurances. Rick, though still dazed and weak, found an odd sense of peace in her presence. There was something about the way she spoke to him, the way her eyes softened when they met his, that made him feel safe in a world that had suddenly become foreign and overwhelming. The days that followed were a whirlwind of medical assessments, media speculation, and emotional upheaval. Rick's recovery, though slow, was steady, and each day he regained a little more of his strength. But while his body was healing, his mind remained a tangle of confusion and unanswered questions. He remembered bits and pieces, faces, voices, flashes of moments, but there was a glaring void where weeks of his life should have been. And in that void, something felt wrong. Victoria visited daily, her demeanor as poised as ever, though Rick could sense an invisible wall between them. There was something in her eyes, something guarded, that Rick couldn't quite understand. He knew she was relieved to have him back, but there was a coldness to her that made him uneasy, as though she were waiting for something to unravel. Adela, on the other hand, was struggling with her own inner turmoil. The knowledge that Rick had returned filled her with anxiety. Every time she thought of facing him, the weight of her recent decisions pressed down on her like a lead blanket. She had distanced herself from him, emotionally and physically, and had allowed Lucas to fill that void. Now, with Rick awake, she knew she would have to confront the reality of her actions. And yet, amidst the swirling emotions, media attention, and family tension, Selena remained a constant. She had become Rick's lifeline, guiding him through the first difficult steps of his recovery. Although Rick still didn't fully understand who she was or why he felt such a deep connection to her, he clung to her presence like a man adrift in a storm. But the road ahead was not without its battles. Rick's mind, still foggy, struggled to grasp the enormity of what had happened, and as he began to piece together fragments of memories and faces, a growing sense of unease settled in his cell. There were gaps, secrets lurking just beneath the surface, things that no one seemed willing to talk about. The tension in his family, the guarded looks from his mother, the absence of warmth from Adela, all of it weighed on him, casting a shadow over his recovery. The awakening of Rick Smith was not just a medical miracle, it was the beginning of a storm. The choices made in his absence, the secrets kept, and the betrayals yet to be revealed were all about to collide. And Rick, though still weak, was beginning to sense the dark tide rising around him. The hospital room was quiet as usual, the sterile atmosphere almost soothing in its predictability, when Thomas entered with a sense of gravity that pierced the calm. Rick, still pale and fragile from weeks in a coma, lay resting, but his recovery had been steady, and his mind was growing sharper with each passing day. Thomas knew that he couldn't delay the inevitable any longer. He had waited, hoping Rick would be stronger, but the situation was becoming too dangerous. Lucas's influence was spreading, and Adela, Rick's fiancée, was at the center of it. Thomas knew Rick had to be made aware, no matter how fragile his recovery. Selena, who had been carefully arranging Rick's sheets and checking the monitors, sensed the tension in Thomas's demeanor. She glanced at Rick, who met her gaze with a hint of concern. Something important was about to happen, and though she didn't know the details, she could feel it. Thomas approached the bedside, his face serious, and after a brief exchange of pleasantries, he turned to Selena. "Would you mind giving us a few moments?" he asked, his tone gentle but firm. Selena, understanding the need for privacy, nodded and gave Rick a reassuring look before quietly leaving the room. As she closed the door behind her, a faint unease settled in her stomach. She trusted Thomas, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the conversation that was about to unfold would change everything. Thomas pulled a chair close to Rick's bed, sitting down heavily as though the sitting down had to say pressed down on him. Rick, propped up by pillows, looked at his friend, his expression expectant but wary. Though his body was still weak, his mind was increasingly sharp, and he could sense that whatever Thomas was about to tell him wasn't going to be easy to hear. "Rick," Thomas began, his voice low and measured, "I know you're still recovering, but there are things you need to know, things that can't wait any longer." Rick's brow furrowed as he shifted slightly, trying to focus despite the lingering haze of exhaustion. "What is it, Thomas?" he asked, his voice raspy but curious. Thomas didn't hesitate. He pulled an envelope from his jacket, thick with documents, and handed it to Rick. "While you were in a coma, I've been investigating what led up to your collapse. I've uncovered some things about Lucas, about the company, and about Adela that you need to know." Rick's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the pages inside. The further he read, the more tension etched across his face. The documents detailed the shady financial transactions, the high-risk deals Rick had never authorized, and the ways in which Lucas had slowly begun to exert control over the company while Rick lay helpless in the hospital. But worse than the business betrayals were the personal ones. Lucas, Rick's supposed business associate, had been slowly manipulating Adela, preying on her fears and insecurities while Rick was unconscious. He had used her to further destabilize the company, turning her against Rick and drawing her deeper into his schemes. The betrayal hit Rick like a physical blow. "Lucas has been pulling strings from the shadows," Thomas explained, filling in the blanks as Rick absorbed the contents of the envelope. "He's destabilized the company and taken advantage of your absence and Adela. I don't know how deeply involved she is, but I believe she's been under his influence for a while. I don't think she fully understands how far he's taken things, but Rick, she's been manipulated." Rick closed his eyes, leaning back against the pillows, trying to process the overwhelming sense of betrayal. He had always been wary of Lucas, but the idea that Adela, the woman he had once planned to marry, could be swayed by him, especially while Rick was fighting for his life, was almost too much to bear. Thomas continued, his voice gentle but firm. "I don't know when Adela started giving in to Lucas's pressure, but it's clear he's been using her. I don't think she's beyond redemption, Rick, but you need to know the truth if you're going to decide how to move forward." Rick remained silent for what felt like an eternity, his mind reeling from the weight of the revelations. The betrayal of Lucas stung, but it was the idea that Adela had become entangled in his schemes that truly gutted him. For weeks, while he lay unconscious, the life he had worked so hard to build had been unraveling, and now he was left to pick up the pieces. Finally, Rick opened his eyes and looked at Thomas, his expression one of quiet determination despite the turmoil raging inside him. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Thomas met his gaze, his voice calm but resolute. "First, you need to focus on getting stronger. You're in no shape to make big decisions right now, but when you're ready, we'll confront Lucas together. We have enough evidence to expose him and stop him from causing more damage to the company. As for Adela, that's your call. She's made mistakes, but I believe there's still a chance for her to step away from Lucas and work with you to rebuild what's been lost." Rick nodded slowly, the gravity of the situation settling over him like a heavy cloak. He knew Thomas was right. He couldn't act rashly, but he also couldn't ignore the truth. He needed time to think, to heal, and to decide how to move forward, not just with the company, but with Adela as well. "Thank you," Thomas, Rick said quietly, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know how I would have survived all this without you." Thomas smiled faintly, his expression serious but reassuring. "I'm always here for you, Rick. But for now, rest. We'll deal with this when you're ready." As Thomas stood to leave, Rick watched him go, the weight of what he had just learned pressing down on him. The room felt suddenly heavier, the air thick with unspoken fears and unresolved decisions. Moments later, the door opened again, and Selena re-entered the room, her presence like a balm to Rick's troubled mind. She moved quietly, instinctively knowing that whatever had just been discussed had shaken him deeply. "Are you okay?" Selena asked softly, moving closer to his bedside. She didn't pry, but her concern was palpable. Rick looked up at her, and for a moment he didn't want to think about the betrayals, the company, or Adela. He just wanted to hold on to the one thing in his life that felt solid and real. He took Selena's hand, holding it tightly, as though drawing strength from their unspoken bond. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for being here." Selena smiled, her gentle warmth wrapping around him like a comforting embrace. "You don't need to thank me, Rick. I'll be here as long as you need me." And in that moment, as Rick held Selena's hand, he realized that in the midst of the chaos, she had become his anchor, the one steady thing he could count on in a world that had been turned upside down. The tension in the room thickened as Lucas's threat hung in the air, his calm facade replaced by a menacing tone that chilled everyone present. Adela, still seated, was visibly trembling, torn between the fear of what Lucas might do and the shame of how far she had allowed things to go. Thomas, standing resolutely beside Rick, remained composed, though his eyes flickered with the awareness that things had escalated dangerously. Rick, sitting at the head of the table, stayed silent for a moment, his gaze unwavering as he studied Lucas. Despite the physical weakness still lingering from his coma, he exuded a quiet strength, one born from the resolve to take back control of his life and legacy. Lucas's threat, although unnerving, didn't shake him the way it might have weeks ago. Rick had already faced death, had seen the fragility of life up close, and now he knew that fear couldn't govern his decisions anymore. Finally, Rick spoke, his voice calm but filled with authority. "Lucas, your threats only prove how far you've fallen. You've manipulated, lied, and betrayed, using my absence to tear apart what I've built. And worse, using the people I care about to achieve your own selfish goals. But you underestimated one thing." Lucas narrowed his eyes, the tension between them palpable. "And what's that?" Rick leaned forward, his gaze locked on Lucas's. "I'm not afraid of you." The silence that followed was deafening. Lucas, momentarily caught off guard by Rick's calm defiance, glared at him, his fists clenching at his sides. He glanced at Adela, who had now openly turned against him, then back to Rick, realizing his once ironclad control over the situation was slipping away. Thomas, sensing the growing danger in Lucas's posture, decided it was time to reveal the final card they had to play. "Lucas," he said, pulling out another set of documents, "you've left a paper trail, and we've got enough evidence to not only have you removed from the company, but to press charges for fraud, embezzlement, and corporate sabotage. The authorities have already been notified." Lucas's eyes flashed with anger, his voice rising in desperation. "You can't be serious. You don't have the power to do that. I've got connections, lawyers who will bury you in court." Thomas didn't flinch. "We've got enough to destroy you legally, Lucas. The evidence is airtight. Any lawyer you bring in won't be able to save you from this." Lucas's mask of control slipped completely, and for the first time a hint of panic crossed his face. He glanced around the room, realizing that there was no one left on his side. Even Adela had distanced herself from him, her eyes downcast, filled with regret. The walls were closing in, and Lucas knew it. "You think you can just take everything from me?" Lucas hissed, his voice venomous. "After everything I've done to keep this company running while you were gone, I did what had to be done. And now you want to throw it all away and destroy me." Rick stood, his legs shaky but his resolve strong. He met Lucas's gaze with unflinching calm. "I'm not destroying you, Lucas. You did that yourself the moment you decided to betray everyone around you. Now, you'll face the consequences." Lucas's expression hardened as he realized he had no way out. He was cornered, and his carefully constructed plan had crumbled. Without another word, he stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The echo of the door reverberated in the room, marking the end of Lucas's reign over Rick's life. For a moment, the room was still, the tension slowly dissipating. Adela sat in her chair, tears silently streaming down her face. She couldn't look at Rick, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her like a stone. "Rick," she whispered, her voice broken, "I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I was just so scared." Rick turned to her, his expression softening as he took in her remorse. "Adela," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "I know you were manipulated, and I know fear can make people do things they wouldn't normally do. But trust is hard to rebuild once it's broken." Adela's tears fell harder, her shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs. "I understand if you can't forgive me, Rick. I don't even forgive myself for what I did." Rick sighed, sitting back down slowly, his body still weak from his recovery. "I need time to process all of this. I don't know what the future holds for us, Adela, but what I do know is that I need to move forward from here, rebuild what's been lost." Adela nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand." Thomas, sensing that the hardest part of the confrontation was over, cleared his throat. "I'll make sure everything with Lucas is handled from here. You focus on recovering and moving forward, Rick." Rick nodded, his eyes tired but resolute. "Thank you, Thomas. I couldn't have done this without you." Thomas smiled, placing a hand on Rick's shoulder. "You're stronger than you think, Rick. You've always been." As Thomas left the room to handle the legal matters, Adela stood shakily from her chair, wiping her tears. "I'll leave you to rest," she said, her voice small, almost fragile. "I'm so sorry." Rick watched her go, the door closing softly behind her. He sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space she had left, his mind awash with conflicting emotions. The woman he had once loved was no longer the same, and though he felt a deep sadness for what they had lost, he also knew that his path forward was now clearer. Just as the weight of the day's events began to settle on him, the door opened again, and Selena entered quietly. She had been waiting just outside, knowing that whatever had transpired in that room was crucial for Rick. She could see the exhaustion in his face, the emotional toll it had taken on him. Without saying a word, she walked over to him, gently placing her hand on his. Rick looked up at her, and for the first time that day, he felt a sense of peace. "You did it," Selena said softly, her voice filled with quiet pride. "You took back control." Rick nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of gratitude and relief. "I couldn't have done it without you, Selena," he said quietly. "Thank you for everything." If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 5 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Selena smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. "I'll always be here for you, Rick." In that moment, as the storm of betrayal and lies began to calm, Rick knew that his future, though uncertain, was his again to shape. And with Selena by his side, he felt stronger than ever to face whatever came next. As Rick embraced his mother, the weight of years of silent expectations and unspoken emotions began to lift. For so long, their relationship had been defined by duty, responsibility, and the unyielding pressure to maintain the yang. But in that moment, something shifted between them, a mutual understanding that the path forward required change. Not only in the way Rick lived his life, but also in how Victoria viewed her role in it. Victoria, always the powerful matriarch, had spent her life making difficult decisions for the sake of the family. But as she held Rick close, she realized that her son was no longer the boy who needed protecting and guiding. He was a man who had come through immense trials physically, emotionally, and mentally, and had emerged stronger. It was time to let him take the reins, even if it meant relinquishing some of the control she had clung to for so long. As they pulled apart, Victoria looked into Rick's eyes with a newfound respect. "I know you'll do what's right for this family, Rick," she said, her voice softer than it had been in years. "But know that I'm always here, not to control, but to support you." Rick smiled, appreciating the sentiment. "I'll need your support, Mother, but things are going to be different from now on. The decisions we make about the company, about our lives, they need to reflect who we are now, not who we were." Victoria nodded, understanding. The world had changed, and so had Rick. "I trust you, son," she said, finally letting go of the last remnants of control she had held onto for so long. With that, Rick left the study, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. The conversation with his mother had been a necessary step in reclaiming his life. But there was still much work to be done. The road to recovery physically, emotionally, and in terms of repairing the damage to the company would be long. But for the first time since waking up from his coma, Rick felt truly ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As he walked down the hallway, he passed the room where Selena was quietly attending to some paperwork. He paused in the doorway, watching her for a moment. There was something about her presence that always seemed to calm him, to remind him that no matter how turbulent life became, there were still people he could rely on, people who cared about him for who he was, not for the name he carried or the power he wielded. Selena looked up and saw him standing there, a gentle smile immediately lighting up her face. "How did it go?" she asked, sensing that the conversation with his mother had been an important one. Rick stepped inside and sat down across from her. "Better than I expected," he admitted, leaning back in the chair with a sigh of relief. "We're not completely there yet, but for the first time I feel like she's really listening to me." Selena smiled warmly. "That's a good start. You've been through a lot, Rick, and it sounds like you're finally starting to take control of your life again." Rick nodded, looking at her with gratitude. "You've been a big part of that, you know. I don't think I would have gotten through these last few weeks without you." Selena blushed slightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm just doing my job." "It's more than that," Rick said, his voice sincere. "You've been there for me in a way that goes beyond your job, and I want you to know that it means a lot to me." Selena looked down, clearly moved by his words, before meeting his eyes again. "I care about you, Rick. I care about your recovery, but I also care about you as a person." Rick smiled, feeling the depth of her words. In the midst of all the chaos, Selena had been his anchor, steady, unwavering, and always there when he needed her most. "I don't know what's next," Rick said after a pause. "There's still so much to figure out: what to do about Adela, how to rebuild the company, how to make sense of everything that's happened. But for the first time, I feel like I'm not alone in facing it." Selena reached across the table and took his hand, her touch gentle but reassuring. "You're not alone, Rick. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Rick squeezed her hand, a sense of calm settling over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was standing on solid ground. As the days passed, Rick focused on rebuilding his life piece by piece. The company required careful restructuring after the damage Lucas had done, but with Thomas's legal expertise and Rick's renewed energy, they began to untangle the mess and set things right. Lucas, now out of the picture, would face the consequences of his actions, both legally and personally. Adela, meanwhile, kept her distance, respecting Rick's need for space. Though they occasionally exchanged civil conversations, the depth of their connection had been irreparably damaged. Rick didn't hold hatred in his heart for her. He understood the fear and vulnerability that had driven her decisions, but he also knew that their relationship could never be the same. They both needed to move on, and in time, perhaps they could each find their own paths to healing. But in the midst of all the uncertainty, one thing remained constant: Selena. She continued to be a source of support, strength, and quiet love. Their bond deepened as Rick's recovery progressed, and with each passing day, Rick found himself drawn more and more to the woman who had been by his side through it all. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony overlooking the mansion's gardens, Rick turned to Selena and said, "I don't know where life is going to take me from here, but I do know one thing: I want you to be a part of it." Selena smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else." In that moment, Rick knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he could face them because he had found not just his strength, but someone who truly believed in him. And for the first time in a long time, the future felt full of possibility. Rick took a deep breath, knowing the conversation with his mother would be difficult but necessary. "Mother, for as long as I can remember, I've been following a path laid out for me, one that you and Father built with the best of intentions. But after everything that's happened, after nearly losing my life, I've realized I can't keep living in the shadow of those expectations. The company, the family, it's time I run things my way." Victoria studied him carefully, her face a mix of pride and concern. She had always known Rick would one day want to make his own choices, but hearing him speak with such determination made her realize just how much he had changed. "I understand, Rick," she said quietly, "but what exactly are you proposing?" Rick sat back down, resting his hands on the papers spread across the table. "For one, I want to step back from the company for a while. I need time to focus on my recovery, both physically and emotionally. I'm not walking away forever, but I need space to reevaluate what I really want." Victoria's eyebrows furrowed slightly. "And who will take over in your absence?" "I've thought about that," Rick replied, his voice calm but resolute. "Thomas has proven his loyalty and competence. He's been a rock through all of this, and I trust him to manage the company while I take this time. I'll still be involved in the major decisions, but the day-to-day operations need someone with a clear head and a steady hand." Victoria seemed to hesitate for a moment. "Thomas is loyal, yes, but this family has always led the company, Rick. Are you sure about giving him that responsibility?" "I am," Rick said firmly. "Thomas knows the business inside and out, and more importantly, he's not driven by the same ambitions that nearly destroyed us. I trust him to guide the company in a direction that aligns with what we've built, but also to take it forward in a way that respects the changes we need to make." Victoria sighed, but there was a trace of understanding in her eyes. "It's a big decision, Rick. But if you believe it's what's best, I'll support you." Rick smiled softly. "Thank you, Mother. I'm also going to focus more on my personal life, on finding balance. I can't keep pouring everything into the business at the expense of my health and happiness." Victoria nodded, sensing a shift in her son that she hadn't expected. He wasn't just taking control of the company, he was taking control of his own destiny. "You're right, Rick. You've been through enough to know what you need. I've always been proud of you, but seeing you take this step, I'm proud in a different way." As Victoria leaned back in her chair, Rick felt a sense of relief wash over him. The conversation had gone better than he had anticipated, but he knew that the hardest discussion still lay ahead, particularly with Adela. Later that afternoon, after his meeting with Victoria, Rick sat in the mansion's garden, surrounded by the calm and beauty of the flowers and trees. It was a peaceful space, one that gave him clarity. Adela's words from their last conversation lingered in his mind, but he knew they needed to talk again, this time with more finality. Adela, after her encounter with Selena, had been reflecting on everything, the mistakes she had made, her role in Lucas's manipulation, and the fragile state of her relationship with Rick. She knew she needed to face the truth and accept whatever decision Rick made, even if it meant losing him. When Adela approached the garden, Rick was seated on a bench under the shade of a large oak tree. He looked up as she neared, his expression calm but serious. "Adela," he greeted, motioning for her to sit beside him. She sat, her hands clasped nervously in her lap. "Rick, I know we've talked before, but there's still so much I need to say, so much I need to apologize for." Rick nodded, his eyes soft but resolute. "I know, Adela, and I've thought a lot about everything too. But before you say anything, I want you to know that I don't hold anger toward you. What happened with Lucas, the mistakes we both made, we were both in difficult places." Adela's eyes filled with tears as she listened. Rick, I'm so sorry for what I did. I let fear control me, and I made terrible decisions. I never wanted to betray you, but I was so scared of losing everything." Rick turned to her, his gaze steady. "I know you didn't mean to hurt me, Adela, and I understand how Lucas manipulated the situation. But we've both changed through this, and I think we both know that things can't go back to the way they were." Adela wiped her eyes, nodding through her tears. "I do know that, but it hurts to admit it." Rick sighed deeply. "It hurts me too, but we need to move forward separately. I want you to find your own path, one where you're not afraid or dependent on anyone else. You deserve that." Adela's tears fell silently, but she managed a small, sad smile. "I suppose I've known this was coming. I just hoped, maybe." Rick reached out, taking her hand gently. "You'll always be important to me, Adela. We had something real once, and I don't regret that. But it's time for both of us to heal, and we can't do that together." Adela nodded, squeezing his hand tightly for a moment before letting go. "Thank you, Rick, for everything. I'll always care about you, and I hope you find the happiness you deserve." "I hope you do, too," Rick said softly. As Adela stood and walked back toward the mansion, Rick felt a bittersweet sense of closure. It wasn't the ending he had once envisioned for them, but it was the ending they both needed. He sat for a long time, staring out at the gardens, reflecting on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the recovery, the confrontations, they had all led him to this moment of clarity. His future was his own now, and though it was filled with uncertainty, it was also filled with hope. And as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the mansion and the gardens, Rick felt a quiet peace settle over him. The road ahead would be difficult, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone. With the support of his mother, the loyalty of Thomas, and the quiet strength of Selena, Rick was ready to rebuild his life, one step at a time. Selena gazed at Rick, her heart filled with emotion she had carefully kept in check throughout his recovery. She had been his nurse, his caretaker, and his confidant. But somewhere along the way, her feelings had deepened beyond professional care. Yet the uncertainty of exploring this new connection both excited and frightened her. "Rick," she began softly, her voice filled with warmth, "I've been by your side through your darkest moments. And in that time, I've come to know a side of you that not many people get to see. You're a strong, kind, and determined man, and it's only natural that feelings would develop during such an intense time. But you're still healing physically, emotionally, and I want to make sure that what you're feeling is real and not just part of this recovery process." Rick nodded, understanding her hesitation. "I know, Selena, and that's why I'm not asking for anything right now except honesty. I want us to take this one step at a time, with no expectations or rush. I just couldn't go on without telling you how I feel. You've been my rock through all of this, and I feel like there's something more between us, something worth exploring." Selena smiled gently, touched by his vulnerability. "I feel it too, Rick," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I agree we need to give ourselves time. You've just taken back control of your life, and I want to make sure that whatever we have grows from a place of understanding, not out of the intensity of everything you've been through." Rick exhaled, feeling both relieved and hopeful. "That's all I want, Selena. Just the chance to see where this goes without pressure." They stood together in silence for a moment, gazing at the stars, both of them feeling the weight of what had just been shared, but also the lightness of finally acknowledging the possibility of something more. The night air was cool, but there was warmth between them, an unspoken understanding that whatever came next, they would face it with patience and care. As Rick left the terrace, he felt a quiet contentment settle over him. For the first time in a long while, his life felt like it was heading in the right direction, not just with the company, not just with his family, but with himself. He was rebuilding, and he knew that with the support of those around him, especially Selena, he could truly move forward. Selena remained on the terrace for a while after Rick left, her thoughts racing but her heart at peace. She had been through her own battles, and now, with this unexpected connection between her and Rick, she knew that life could offer surprises in the most unexpected ways. She wasn't sure where their relationship would go, but she was willing to take the journey with him, step by step. The next morning, Rick felt lighter than he had in months. His conversation with Adela had been difficult but necessary. And while there was sadness in letting go of what they once had, there was also relief in knowing they were both free to move forward. His discussion with Selena the night before had filled him with a quiet hope there was a new beginning on the horizon, and he was ready to embrace it. Victoria, who had sensed a shift in Rick's demeanor, joined him for breakfast in the dining room. "You seem more at peace today, Rick," she observed, her tone gentle. "It suits you." "It suits you." Rick smiled. "I am, Mother. I've made some decisions about Adela, about the company, and even about my own life. I'm ready to take things in a new direction." Victoria sipped her tea, nodding approvingly. "Good. You've always had the strength to lead, but now I see you found the balance to live as well. Your father would be proud." Hearing that brought Rick a quiet satisfaction. "Thank you, Mother. I'm ready to rebuild, but this time I'm doing it with a clear mind and heart." As they ate, they discussed the future, Andre's new role in the company, the charitable projects Rick wanted to pursue, and the changes they would make together. There was still much to do, but Rick no longer felt overwhelmed. He had the support he needed, and most importantly, he had found a sense of purpose that extended beyond the walls of the company. Later that day, as Rick walked through the mansion's expansive gardens, he reflected on how much had changed. The chaos that had once consumed his life was beginning to settle, replaced by clarity and determination. The relationships around him had shifted, some had strengthened, like his bond with his mother, and others, like with Adela, had ended, but in a way that allowed both of them to heal. And then there was Selena. He didn't know what the future held for them, but he was hopeful. For the first time in a long time, Rick felt like he was finally living for himself, not for the expectations of others. He was ready to face whatever challenges came his way, knowing that he had people in his life who truly cared for him. As the sun set that evening, casting a warm glow over the mansion, Rick felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The future was uncertain, but it was also full of possibility, and with Selena by his side, even if only as a friend for now, he knew that he could build a life that was not only successful but truly fulfilling. Rick smiled as Selena's hand rested in his, her words echoing the sentiment he had felt growing for some time. "Selena, I know we said we'd take things slowly, And I still believe in that, but I also want you to know that I see a future with you. These past few months, getting to know you outside of everything that happened outside the chaos has shown me how much you mean to me. I don't want to rush anything, but I also don't want to hide how I feel." Selena looked up at Rick, her heart warming at his sincerity. "Rick, you've been so honest and patient, and I appreciate that more than you know. I've been cautious, maybe because I was scared, but the truth is, I feel the same way. I want to see where this journey takes us to. We've both been through so much, but I think we've come out of it stronger." Rick's smile deepened, relief washing over him. "Then let's continue this journey together and see what unfolds. I'm not expecting anything to happen overnight, but I want us to be open to whatever comes." Selena nodded, her eyes glistening with hope. Together, she said softly, her voice steady, "If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 6 in the comments to let me know you're still with me." They stood there for a moment, the shade of the oak tree providing a quiet refuge for their conversation. The gentle breeze carried with it a sense of renewal, of possibilities that neither of them had anticipated when they first met under such intense circumstances. Their bond, born in crisis, had grown into something real, something worth nurturing. Rick felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. The company was on the path to recovery, his relationship with his family was stronger, and most importantly, he was finally living a life he had chosen for himself. And now, with Selena by his side, he felt like the future was brighter than it had ever been. As they continued their walk through the gardens, their conversation shifted to lighter topics, but the promise of a shared future lingered between them. They had built something together, something that had started in the most unexpected of ways, and now they were ready to see where it would lead. The months that followed were filled with growth and discovery. The Smith Company continued to flourish under Rick and Andre's leadership, with new projects that focused on sustainability and giving back to the community. The company's transformation became a model for other businesses, showing that success could be measured not only in profits but in the positive impact it had on the world around it. Victoria, watching her sons thrive, felt a quiet pride. She had raised them to be strong, and now they were not only leading the family legacy but reshaping it for the better. She had stepped back, allowing them to lead, and in doing so she had found her own peace. Adela, now studying abroad, had embraced her journey of self-discovery. The distance had allowed her to gain perspective, and though her time with Rick was behind her, she was grateful for the lessons she had learned. She knew that her future was unwritten, and for the first time she felt empowered to write it on her own terms. As for Rick and Selena, their relationship blossomed in ways neither had expected. They continued to spend time together, their connection deepening with each shared moment. What had once been a professional relationship had transformed into a partnership built on trust, mutual respect, and a genuine affection that neither of them could deny. One evening, as they sat together on the mansion's terrace, watching the sun set over the horizon, Rick turned to Selena with a smile that held both affection and certainty. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Rick began, his voice soft but sure, "about us, about the future. And I know we've been taking things slow, but I also know that I don't want to imagine my life without you in it." Selena looked at him, her heart fluttering at the sincerity in his voice. "Rick, I don't know where this will lead, but I do know that I want to take this next step with you, Rick. I'm ready for whatever comes next, and I want us to explore that together." Selena's eyes softened as she squeezed his hand, her smile mirroring his. "I feel the same, Rick. I'm ready too. Let's take that step and see what the future holds." And so they did. Together they faced the uncertainties of life, knowing that whatever came their way, they would walk that path side by side. The future was unknown, but it was theirs to shape, and with each passing day, they found new reasons to believe in the beauty of what they were building together. Rick and Selena, hand in hand, felt the weight of their past lift as they stepped into the mansion, now a symbol of renewal rather than burden. The journey they had shared, marked by moments of uncertainty and healing, had brought them to this place, a new beginning, built on trust, respect, and a love that had grown steadily in the most unexpected of circumstances. The Smith family, once fragmented by pressure and expectations, had found a way to rebuild not only the company but also the ties that bound them. Under Rick and Andre's joint leadership, the company thrived, not just in profits but in the lives it touched. As their new initiatives brought tangible improvements to the community, what had once been a singular focus on financial success had transformed into something far greater, an enterprise driven by purpose, values, and the desire to leave a lasting, positive legacy. Victoria, who had once held the family reins with a firm grip, watched from her office as her sons led with compassion and vision. Her smile reflected her pride, not just in the success of the company, but in the growth of her family. She had learned that true leadership meant knowing when to step aside, trusting her sons to carve their own path forward. Meanwhile, Adela, far away in her new life abroad, embraced her fresh start with optimism. Studying and rediscovering herself, she finally found the space to heal and grow. Though she had made mistakes, she carried no resentment, only lessons. Rick's forgiveness and understanding had given her the freedom to move forward, and with it, a renewed sense of purpose. As Rick and Selena moved through the mansion, they felt a peaceful stillness in the air, knowing that the worst of the storms had passed. Their relationship, once rooted in crisis, had blossomed into something real and lasting. Together, they had learned the importance of patience, honesty, and the willingness to support each other, both as partners and as individuals. Outside, the sun set, casting the gardens in a warm, golden glow, a fitting end to a day that marked the beginning of their shared future. The trials they had faced, from betrayals to personal revelations, had not broken them. Instead, they had emerged stronger, more grounded, and more united in their shared vision for the life they wanted to build together. And so the story of Rick, Selena, and the Smith family did not end with finality, but with the promise of something even greater, a future built on love, growth, and the enduring belief that, no matter the challenges, they could face it all together. As we come to the end of Rick and Selena's journey, we've witnessed powerful themes of love, growth, forgiveness, and the importance of self-discovery. From the transformation of the Smith family to the rebuilding of relationships based on trust, each character has shown us that no matter the challenges, there is always room for renewal and hope. So what have you learned from this story? Reflect on the lessons of patience, resilience, and creating a future rooted in authenticity. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below on one thing you've learned from this journey and how you plan to bring it into practice in your own life. If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.